It's a quiet evening at the police station of Willowmere, and Detective Alaric Thorne is wrapping up his shift. Just as he stands to leave, an elderly woman enters the station. She walks slowly but with determination, leaning on her cane as she approaches the front desk. The officers look up, surprised by her late arrival. The woman, small and frail, introduces herself as Eleanor Winslow and speaks in a clear, calm voice. "I'm here to confess to a lifetime of sins," she announces, pausing before continuing. "I've killed people. Many people. Over the past 68 years. Detective Thorne exchanges looks with his colleagues, taken aback by her statement. He approaches Eleanor, asking if she would join him in a nearby interview room to discuss further. She agrees, settling into the chair across from him, hands folded in her lap, her expression unwavering. She's polite, poised, even as she prepares to talk about murder. Eleanor starts listing names, places, and dates, her voice steady but her memory sometimes flickering in and out. "I can't recall them all perfectly," she admits, "but some names, some stay with you." Despite her age, there's an unsettling sharpness to her, a certainty that she's recounting real events. Detective Thorne listens carefully, jotting down details as she speaks. Each time she pauses, he prompts her to continue. Some names ring faint bells, aligning with old cases, some of which were closed, others still open. His initial skepticism gives way to intrigue, especially when she mentions a victim named Margaret Ashford, a name linked to a cold case in a neighboring town. "When was this?" Thorne asks, studying her face. Eleanor tilts her head thoughtfully, replying with the year and specific details about Margaret's last moments. Thorne feels a chill. She shouldn't know these details, yet she recounts them with eerie familiarity. As Eleanor continues, she reveals bits and pieces that add credibility to her claims. A man named Charles Blackwood, another name from an old missing persons file, is mentioned. Thorne presses her for more details, trying to catch her in a lie or inconsistency, but Eleanor's recollections are unnervingly consistent. Eleanor grows reflective, speaking of justice and balancing the scales. Her language is cryptic, but her tone is matter-of-fact, almost detached. "People can take and take, thinking no one will ever hold them accountable," she says quietly. "But they never know who's watching." Thorne can't tell if she's confessing out of remorse or if there's another reason she's here. "So why now?" he asks. She shrugs slightly, a small smile forming on her lips. "I thought it was time someone knew," she says simply. Detective Thorne leaves the room to confer with his team, his mind racing. The details Eleanor provided align with certain cold cases that should be well beyond her knowledge. The officers at the station are both intrigued and disturbed, unsure if they're dealing with a masterful confession or a fragile mind blurring fact and fiction. Returning to the room, Thorne finds Eleanor waiting patiently, hands folded. She meets his gaze, a faint, almost contented smile on her face, as if satisfied by finally sharing her story. Back in his office, Detective Thorne sits at his desk, reviewing the notes he took from Eleanor's confession. Her claims about certain names and dates are unsettlingly precise, with connections to specific cold cases. He gathers a small team to begin verifying her claims, feeling a strange urgency driving him to find the truth. Detective Thorne assigns each detective on his team a name and a location mentioned by Eleanor, instructing them to retrieve old case files and check for any connections. As his team starts their research, Thorne decides to pull the file on Margaret Ashford, the first name Eleanor mentioned, with specific details. Margaret Ashford's case file from 50 years ago confirms Eleanor's details. A suspicious death marked as unresolved, with no witnesses or suspects. The chilling alignment with Eleanor's story unsettles him. "There's no way she could have known this," Thorne mutters, beginning to question how a seemingly gentle elderly woman could recall these specifics about cold cases. Detective Thorne's interest is piqued, and he decides to dig deeper into Eleanor's history. He reviews public records, discovering that Eleanor was once a married woman, living in a modest home in Willowmere. She had children, and later in life, she became a widow. There's nothing in her background that hints at a history of violence or criminal activity, and yet here she is, confessing to murder. As he studies her life, he finds an unusual pattern. Eleanor moved frequently from one town to another every few years. Each location she lived in has a record of an unsolved death, although no one ever connected these deaths to her. But looking at the pattern, Thorne senses a possibility. Could Eleanor have been moving to evade suspicion, leaving a trail of death wherever she went? One of Thorne's colleagues, Detective Callum Blackwood, returns with updates on a few other cases Eleanor mentioned. He points out similarities in victim profiles. People who were either criminals themselves or involved in questionable activities. One was an embezzler, another a known extortionist. The idea of Eleanor as a vigilante killer, a frail yet determined woman with a twisted sense of justice, sends chills down Thorne's spine. Thorne shares his suspicions with Callum. She's not just confessing, she's proud of it. He says, "But why wait this long? And why come forward now?" Callum, equally disturbed, suggests an interview strategy to get Eleanor to elaborate on her motivations. They both feel the weight of each victim's story, realizing that their detective work is unraveling a carefully woven tapestry of Eleanor's dark past. Thorne returns to the interview room, determined to draw more from Eleanor. She's sitting in her chair, her hands folded, waiting with the same unsettling calm. He begins by mentioning Margaret Ashford, probing for more information on her motive. Eleanor's expression shifts, a flicker of satisfaction crossing her face. "Margaret," she murmurs almost fondly. "She thought she was untouchable, but she made too many enemies." "Enemies like you?" Thorne presses, hoping to extract specifics. Eleanor chuckles, shaking her head. "Not enemies, detective. Just people who could see through her. People who wouldn't let her get away with it." Eleanor's evasive language frustrates Thorne, but she soon adds, "Some people need someone to remind them of consequences, detective. I merely played my part." Eleanor grows silent, as if she's suddenly exhausted. She mutters about Cassian, the same name she mentioned before, and how he helped her understand. This mysterious figure only deepens the mystery, making Thorne wonder if Cassian was her partner, her accomplice, or perhaps someone else entirely. He tries to get her to describe Cassian, asking about his role, but Eleanor's memory seems to blur, her expression distant. "Cassian, he understood balance," she says quietly. "He knew justice wasn't about the law, it was about the soul." As Eleanor's words echo in Thorne's mind, he begins to feel like he's only scratching the surface. Leaving the room, he tells his team to investigate any connection between Eleanor and this mysterious Cassian. As the detectives work to uncover more, Thorne is left with a creeping sense of dread, aware that he might be dealing with something far more twisted than a mere confession. Detective Thorne sits alone in his office late into the night, surrounded by Eleanor's case files and his notes from the past 2 days. The woman's confession is unsettling, yet undeniably intriguing. But inconsistencies have started to surface. Thorne replays their conversations in his mind, hearing her words over and over, sensing something he can't quite place, small details that feel just a bit wrong. Thorne decides he needs to dig deeper and question everything Eleanor has said. Could she be making it all up? Or is she manipulating them to cover up a darker truth? Early the next morning, Thorne assembles his team and reviews Eleanor's statements. He emphasizes that she's given many clear details, but some are suspiciously vague or outright contradictory. For example, she mentioned Margaret Ashford's death year with certainty, but when asked about another victim, Charles Blackwood, she faltered, struggling to remember the season, let alone the year. Yet these were supposed to be Eleanor's own crimes. Detective Callum Blackwood voices his doubts, suggesting that Eleanor might be embellishing or lying entirely. It's possible she's just an elderly woman with dementia, confusing herself with stories she's heard or read, he proposes, though his tone lacks conviction. Despite his suggestion, the cases Eleanor cited still correspond to real deaths or disappearances, cold cases scattered across decades. Thorne isn't convinced it's that simple. No one just stumbles upon those details. These are specific names, specific cases. She's not making them up, he says, though he can't shake the feeling that Eleanor is somehow toying with them. Deciding to probe Eleanor's motives further, Thorne returns to the interrogation room, determined to pinpoint her reasons for confessing now. Eleanor is already waiting, her gaze calm and unwavering. Thorne leads with a straightforward question. "Why now, Eleanor? Why come forward after all these years?" Eleanor's face remains expressionless. "People shouldn't leave this world with secrets, detective. It does something to the soul, a poison." Her voice is firm, but Thorne detects a hint of something else. Hesitation, perhaps? He pushes, suggesting that maybe she doesn't remember everything as clearly as she claims. For the first time, Eleanor's confidence falters. She lets out a soft, humorless laugh. I suppose memory isn't as sharp as it once was, she admits, though her eyes flash with something darker. But some things, detective, stay with you. I may forget a season, a day, but the faces, they linger. Detective Thorne shifts the conversation to Cassian, pressing for details. But Eleanor grows defensive, guarded, as though discussing him touches a nerve. Cassian, he was someone who saw the world as it was. The things people are willing to ignore, he couldn't, she says cryptically. Thorne presses, asking if Cassian helped her with the murders. Eleanor's expression hardens, and she leans back in her chair. Detective, some things are meant to be carried alone. But she quickly adds, Cassian understood balance, though, I could say that much. Eleanor's mention of balance makes Thorne uneasy. She seems to view her supposed actions as righteous, almost holy, as if each killing were a necessary act in a grand scheme of justice. As Thorne studies Eleanor's words, Detective Blackwood walks in, file in hand, interrupting the interrogation with an update. He's found records of an Eleanor Winslow who attended college in a different name, Eleanor Whitaker, decades ago. A small but disturbing detail Eleanor never mentioned. Returning to Eleanor, Thorne confronts her with this discrepancy. Eleanor Whitaker. Does that ring a bell? For a split second, Eleanor's eyes shift, but she regains her composure. Yes, that was once my name, she says coolly, her expression unreadable. Thorne notes this inconsistency, wondering if more buried secrets are waiting to be unearthed. Outside the room, Detective Blackwood raises his eyebrows, sensing Thorne's unease. What do you think, Alaric? Blackwood asks, a hint of trepidation in his voice. Thorne's response is quiet but resolute. I think we're dealing with something deeper than we imagined. Detective Thorne stands at a bulletin board where he's pinned various names, dates, and faces that Eleanor mentioned in her confession. Beside him is Detective Callum Blackwood, both of them scrutinizing the connections. Among the names is Cassian, and it remains a point of intrigue. Eleanor's vague description of him as someone who understood balance isn't enough for Thorne. He needs to know who this man is, or was, and if he's still out there. Detective Blackwood suggests researching old newspaper archives and public records to track down anyone named Cassian with connections to Eleanor. The search is daunting but critical, especially as Cassian might be the missing link in Eleanor's chilling puzzle. As Thorne and Blackwood delve into Eleanor's history, they uncover records of an Eleanor Whitaker, her previous name, living in various towns. Each place shows a pattern of suspicious deaths or disappearances. But what strikes Thorne is that in several of these towns, a man named Cassian Hawthorne appears in unrelated records. The name Cassian Hawthorne surfaces twice in minor town events. Once as a guest at a university lecture Eleanor attended, and another time listed as a volunteer for a charity event she organized. Could this be the same Cassian she mentioned? A man she may have met in passing, but who left a lasting impression. Armed with this new information, Thorne confronts Eleanor, hoping to break through her calm veneer. He brings up the name Cassian Hawthorne, watching her carefully for a reaction. Eleanor's eyes narrow for a brief moment, betraying a glint of recognition before she quickly schools her expression. So you remember him, Thorne states, leaning in. Who was Cassian to you, Eleanor? Eleanor's lips curl into a faint smile. Cassian was an inspiration. He saw the flaws of the world, just as I did. We had that in common. Detective Thorne's pulse quickens, sensing he's close to understanding something critical. Inspiration? Did he teach you? Your methods? Thorne asks, carefully choosing his words. Eleanor pauses, as if weighing how much to reveal. He opened my eyes to things I hadn't seen, showed me that justice is rarely served on its own. Her voice is quiet, almost reverent. Some people need guidance, detective. Cassian was a guide. Eleanor's description of Cassian paints him as an influence, or even a mentor, suggesting that her actions may not be solely her own. This admission raises the stakes, as Thorne begins to consider that Eleanor may be part of something larger. Is she alone, or could others like her exist, taking cues from this shadowy figure? Thorne presses on, asking Eleanor if Cassian guided her in committing any specific murders. But she deflects, speaking cryptically of decisions that had to be made. Eleanor's vagueness frustrates Thorne, Yet he can sense her amusement. She seems to enjoy withholding information, as though playing a game only she knows the rules to. Detective Blackwood interrupts the interrogation, calling Thorne outside with a discovery. While researching Cassian Hawthorne, he uncovered a chilling parallel. A series of accidental deaths in a neighboring town where Cassian allegedly resided for a short time in the 1950s. Each death followed a similar pattern to the cases connected to Eleanor. The townspeople called these deaths judgments, as the victims were all individuals with criminal or morally dubious pasts. Thorne's suspicion deepens. Could Cassian have been the original orchestrator of these so-called judgments, passing his beliefs and methods on to Eleanor? Returning to the interrogation room, Thorne confronts Eleanor with the possibility that she's merely a follower of Cassian, continuing his legacy. Eleanor's smile fades, replaced by a calculating look. "Cassian didn't create my convictions, detective," she says, her tone icy. "He merely awakened them. What I did with clear purpose." Thorne challenges her, demanding she explain her purpose. But Eleanor only shakes her head, saying, "You wouldn't understand, detective. You live by the law, but some of us know a truth that runs deeper." Detective Blackwood suggests investigating Cassian Hawthorne's possible burial site, hoping it might yield clues. After hours of searching, they locate his grave, a simple stone bearing his name and dates that align with Eleanor's life. But there's something strange. Flowers have been placed there recently. Fresh, white lilies. Thorne realizes someone has been visiting Cassian's grave, and he wonders if Eleanor had an accomplice, keeping Cassian's memory alive. The implications are chilling. If Eleanor truly believes in Cassian's philosophy, she may have influenced others with her mindset, creating a legacy of judgment that lives beyond her. Thorne leaves the station feeling a nagging sense of dread. If Eleanor has been a guide to others, then her confession may only be the beginning. He realizes that unraveling her story might reveal an entire network of individuals carrying out similar acts in the name of justice. Eleanor's last words to him echo in his mind. "Justice is rarely served on its own, detective." It's been a few days since the discovery of Cassian's grave, and Detective Thorne hasn't slept well. Eleanor's cryptic statements and her apparent reverence for Cassian haunt his thoughts. He knows that her story has layers they haven't uncovered yet, and he suspects there may be a pattern to her victims, a justice that Eleanor claims to be serving. Determined to push further, Thorne spends hours in the records room with Detective Blackwood, reviewing every name and case connected to Eleanor. As they map out Eleanor's alleged victims, Thorne and Blackwood notice a disturbing trend. Each victim was involved in some form of criminal activity or moral wrongdoing that went unpunished. Embezzlers, fraudsters, violent individuals, these people may have escaped formal consequences, but it appears Eleanor judged them worthy of punishment. Thorne senses Eleanor saw herself as a sort of avenger, acting where the legal system failed. The realization is unsettling, casting her confession in a new light. She wasn't just confessing to murder, she was justifying it, as if each act were necessary to balance some cosmic scale of justice. Detective Blackwood suggests calling in a profiler to understand Eleanor's mindset, hoping it will shed light on her motivation. The profiler, Dr. Celestia Armitage, meets with Thorne and Blackwood to discuss her initial analysis. Dr. Armitage explains that Eleanor's actions, if indeed she is guilty of these murders, point to someone with a savior complex. She's not just killing to kill, Dr. Armitage explains. She believes her actions serve a greater purpose. In her mind, she's not a criminal. She's a judge, perhaps even a martyr. The term martyr resonates with Thorne, who recalls Eleanor's claim of balancing the scales. She seems to view herself as an instrument of fate, convinced that her actions were necessary. But why come forward now? Dr. Armitage believes Eleanor may feel her work is done, her final act of atonement being the confession itself. Thorne confronts Eleanor once more, eager to challenge her beliefs. He brings up the pattern they discovered, that each of her victims had some history of wrongdoing, and each escaped punishment. "Is that why you killed them, Eleanor?" he asks. "Did you think you had the right to judge them?" Eleanor's expression turns serene, as though she's been waiting for him to understand. "It's not about the right, detective," she replies. "It's about necessity. If justice won't come for them, someone must step forward." Thorne presses her, questioning her connection to Cassian and the idea that he opened her eyes. Eleanor becomes guarded, refusing to elaborate on Cassian's role, but she admits he was the first person to make her see the world as it truly was. While reviewing Eleanor's past, Detective Blackwood discovers an old photograph of Cassian. To Thorne's shock, Cassian Hawthorne bears a faint resemblance to one of Thorne's own distant relatives. Digging deeper, Thorne learns Cassian is indeed a distant family connection, an ancestor who vanished from family records and whose name was almost forgotten. When Thorne confronts Eleanor with this discovery, her eyes gleam with an unsettling glint. "Ah," she says softly. "It runs in the blood then, doesn't it?" "What are you talking about?" Thorne demands, unnerved. Eleanor leans forward, her gaze piercing. "Justice. It's not just about law, it's about legacy. You, detective, should know that better than anyone." Her words strike an unexpected chord with Thorne, who has always viewed his role as a calling. Eleanor's statement feels eerily personal, and he begins to question his own motivations and beliefs. Thorne learns that Cassian Hawthorne was rumored to be part of a secret society in the mid-20th century, known as the Darklight Circle, which was dedicated to the idea of purging society of corruption. Cassian's disappearance from records coincides with the society's rumored downfall, but it appears his philosophy may have lived on in Eleanor. Thorne realizes that Eleanor might have viewed Cassian as a mentor or even a spiritual guide, perpetuating his beliefs long after his death. As Thorne pieces this information together, he wonders if Eleanor's confession is part of a twisted ritual, a way to pass down Cassian's legacy to him. The implications are chilling. In a tense conversation, Eleanor hints that Thorne's connection to Cassian might be more than just a coincidence. "Justice runs in the blood," she repeats, a faint smile on her face. "You and I, we're part of the same story, detective." Thorne can't shake her words, though he resists their allure. He knows he's nothing like Eleanor or Cassian, yet he can't ignore the pull of her cryptic statement. Could there be truth in what she's saying? Is there a darker side to justice that he has yet to understand? Thorne and Blackwood turn their focus toward the Darklight Circle, hoping to find any remaining members or records that might provide context to Cassian's influence. They discover references to rituals and purges, but little else. Each lead feels like a dead end, but Eleanor's statements linger, leaving them with a haunting possibility. Could there still be followers carrying out Cassian's vision? The detectives grow uneasy, sensing that Eleanor's story is far from over. She might have come forward, but she hasn't truly relinquished her power. She's planted seeds, both in their investigation and in their minds. Back at the station, Detective Thorne watches Eleanor on the monitor in the interview room, her frail figure almost blending into the dim light. He senses that her confession isn't just about closure, but about continuity, as though she's passing on a torch. Eleanor glances up at the camera, meeting his gaze through the lens. She smiles, and Thorne feels a chill, realizing he's standing at the edge of a legacy he never wanted. With each passing day, Eleanor's words take on a life of their own in Thorne's mind. Detective Thorne stands outside Eleanor's house, a decaying mansion on the outskirts of Willowmere. The property exudes an air of mystery, with ivy crawling up the walls and windows obscured by layers of dust and grime. With a warrant in hand, Thorne and Detective Blackwood push open the creaking door, entering Eleanor's home, hoping to uncover clues that will provide answers about her past and connections to the Darklight Circle. The house is dark, filled with the lingering scent of old wood and dust. As they move from room to room, the detectives find themselves surrounded by relics of Eleanor's past. Photos of her as a young woman, old books, peculiar artifacts, and various trinkets that feel carefully curated. Each item tells a story, but it's the locked chest in the corner of the study that catches Thorne's attention. Using a pair of bolt cutters, Thorne pries open the chest. Inside, he finds a collection of journals, maps, and letters, some dating back to the 1950s. Among the papers are detailed notes and records of each murder Eleanor claimed to have committed. The notes reveal patterns in her actions, with cryptic symbols and coded messages that seem to map out her idea of justice. Each page holds names, dates, and crimes committed by each of her victims, written with chilling precision. But it's one name that sends a shiver down Thorne's spine: Cassian Hawthorne. He appears repeatedly in Eleanor's writings, his name connected to events Thorne had not previously associated with the murders. There are phrases like guiding hand, the mentor, and the torchbearer, as though Cassian were a central figure in her life, influencing her twisted version of justice. As Thorne sifts through the papers, he finds encoded messages and passages in Eleanor's handwriting that seem like journal entries. One entry catches his eye. Cassian showed me that justice requires sacrifice. It's not enough to watch from afar. Some things must be done by those willing to bear the burden. Detective Blackwood suggests decrypting the notes and symbols, suspecting they could reveal hidden locations or other crimes Eleanor might not have confessed to. With each note, Thorne realizes the depth of Eleanor's commitment to Cassian's vision. She wasn't just a follower, she was almost a disciple, carrying on his work with a fervor that defies logic. Beneath the journals, Thorne discovers a set of black and white photos, one of which shows a younger Eleanor standing beside a man who resembles Cassian, both of them smiling in front of an unknown location. The photo is eerie, a snapshot of a bond that may have been darker than it appears. As he examines it, Thorne notices a peculiar symbol in the background, a spiral engraved into the stone wall behind them. The detectives continue searching the house until Blackwood finds a hidden door in the back of Eleanor's study, concealed behind a large bookcase. They pry it open to reveal a narrow staircase descending into a dimly lit basement. The basement is a stark contrast to the rest of the house. It's filled with artifacts and ritualistic items, candles, dried herbs, ancient books on justice and morality, and symbols on the walls that match those found in the journals. At the center is a stone pedestal with an engraving of the same spiral symbol from the photo. It's clear this basement served as a space for Eleanor's personal rituals, a place where she enacted what she believed was justice. On the pedestal lies a worn, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. Inside, Thorne finds passages written in Eleanor's handwriting, detailing her beliefs, her admiration for Cassian, and her self-justification for the murders. Each victim is described as a balancing act, each life taken with the belief that it served a greater purpose. The detectives leave Eleanor's house shaken, and they return to the station to confront her once more. Thorne presents her with the photos, maps, and journals they found. Eleanor remains calm, her gaze unflinching as Thorne questions her about the basement and the symbols they uncovered. "Was it worth it, Eleanor?" Thorne asks, a mix of frustration and horror in his voice. "All of those lives, did you really believe you were serving justice?" Eleanor's gaze softens, as if she's addressing a child who doesn't understand. "Justice is rarely served by the law alone, detective. There are forces beyond your understanding. Cassian understood that. And in time, I did too." Thorne presses her on her connection to Cassian, demanding to know why she believes he is still relevant, despite his death decades ago. Eleanor gives him a piercing look, her expression almost pitying. Cassian's work was never about one person, Alaric. He understood that justice was an ongoing force, a legacy. His vision doesn't die with him. It lives on in those willing to accept it. Eleanor then suggests that Thorne himself is part of this legacy, a notion he finds both absurd and disturbing. But her words linger, particularly as she speaks of the burden of true justice and the inevitable torch passing. It's clear that Eleanor views her confession as part of this torch passing, her way of ensuring that her twisted beliefs don't end with her. As Eleanor's words sink in, Thorne realizes that her confession might not be a mere admission of guilt. Instead, it feels like a recruitment tactic, a way of planting seeds of doubt and intrigue in his mind, making him question his own role in the grand scheme of justice. Detective Blackwood, who has been silent, finally speaks up, asking Eleanor if she regrets her actions. Eleanor's face softens, and she replies, "Regret? No, detective. I only regret that so few see the world clearly. Justice is lonely work." Eleanor hints that her confession was never about closure for herself, but about continuity, suggesting that Thorne himself may be part of her legacy. Her words take on an almost hypnotic quality as she speaks of justice as an endless cycle, a mission that can't end with her. Thorne leaves the room, deeply unsettled. Eleanor's influence seems to reach beyond her words, casting a dark shadow on the investigation. It becomes clear to him that her confession was a carefully calculated move, not a surrender, but a handover of sorts. As Thorne and Blackwood return to their desks, they both feel the weight of Eleanor's confession hanging over them. The evidence they've uncovered only confirms her conviction in Cassian's beliefs, and it dawns on Thorne that she may have intended for him to carry on her twisted vision of justice. Thorne glances over his notes and realizes that he's become deeply enmeshed in a web of philosophies that blur the lines between justice and vengeance. Eleanor's influence is insidious, leaving him with questions about his own beliefs and doubts he can't easily shake. Detective Thorne sits alone in his office, surrounded by Eleanor's journals, case notes, and photos. Each document represents a piece of the puzzle, yet the whole picture eludes him, as if Eleanor herself were weaving a trap for his mind. He started to question his own beliefs about justice, haunted by her words about Cassian's influence and the so-called burden of true justice. Her statements about legacy have become an earworm, one that refuses to leave his thoughts. Determined to break free from her influence, Thorne decides to go through the evidence one more time, hoping to find some logical explanation that dismantles her philosophy and exposes her for what she is, a manipulative murderer, not some self-appointed judge of morality. As he reviews the case files, Thorne realizes he's starting to sympathize with Eleanor's view, albeit reluctantly. Each victim she chose wasn't entirely innocent. Each had committed acts of cruelty, corruption, or violence that somehow slipped through the cracks of the justice system. He can't deny that her twisted form of retribution strikes a familiar chord, and it unsettles him to feel even a shred of understanding for her motives. Detective Blackwood enters, sensing Thorne's conflict, and warns him against falling into Eleanor's trap of justification. "She's trying to recruit you, Alaric," Blackwood insists, his tone firm. "She wants you to carry her twisted legacy, to make you feel that her way is the only way." Thorne nods, though he can't shake the feeling that Eleanor has already planted a seed of doubt within him. He agrees with Blackwood's words, but can't deny the allure of her philosophy. How many times has he seen justice falter, watched criminals walk free because of technicalities or insufficient evidence? Eleanor's actions are abhorrent, but they reveal an uncomfortable truth about the imperfections of the system he's sworn to uphold. As they work, Blackwood uncovers a file on a cold case involving a vigilante in a neighboring town in the 1970s. The circumstances are eerily similar to Eleanor's methods, and Thorne begins to suspect that Eleanor may not have acted alone. The case mentions an unknown partner, someone who provided information on targets but remained unseen. Thorne's thoughts return to Cassian Hawthorne and the possibility that Eleanor may have inspired others in her lifetime. They decide to dig into the records for any connections between Eleanor and other unsolved cases, hoping to find evidence of accomplices or followers who might still be carrying out her twisted mission. During a break in the investigation, Thorne decides to confront Eleanor with his suspicions, hoping to shake her composure. He asks her directly, "Did Cassian start this? Was he the one who planted these ideas in your mind?" Eleanor seems almost amused by the question. "Cassian didn't plant anything," she says softly. "He only awakened what was already there. Some people, they're drawn to justice. It's in their nature." Her words have an unnerving effect on Thorne, who finds himself questioning if she's referring to him as well. Eleanor describes her actions as a compulsion, something beyond mere choice, an urge that guided her life. "Once you've seen the truth of justice, real justice, it becomes impossible to ignore," Eleanor explains, her tone growing darker. "You become part of it. You're chosen by it." Thorne's unease grows as he realizes Eleanor may genuinely believe she had no choice, as though a force greater than herself compelled her actions. This realization adds a new layer of complexity, making him wonder if Eleanor's beliefs are the result of manipulation, delusion, or if there's something more profound and disturbing driving her. Dr. Celestia Armitage, the profiler, joins Thorne and Blackwood, having analyzed more of Eleanor's journal entries. She believes Eleanor may be suffering from a type of dissociative disorder, potentially brought on by long-term psychological trauma. Eleanor's mind, Dr. Armitage suggests, might be fragmented, her identity split between her current self and an idealized image of herself as a judge and arbiter. Thorne isn't entirely convinced. He senses a keen intelligence in Eleanor, a manipulative quality that goes beyond psychological illness. Yet, Dr. Armitage's assessment raises questions. Is Eleanor intentionally misleading them? Or does she genuinely believe in her role as a chosen agent of justice? The ambiguity leaves Thorne frustrated, uncertain whether he's dealing with a mastermind or a mentally fractured individual lost in her delusions. Later that night, Thorne returns home, exhausted and haunted by Eleanor's words. As he lies in bed, he begins to drift between sleep and waking, and his mind fills with vivid, unsettling images. He imagines himself standing in the places where Eleanor committed her murders, watching the life drain from her victims, feeling a twisted satisfaction that justice has been served. The vision leaves him shaken, and he wakes in a cold sweat, disturbed by the intensity of the experience. It feels as if Eleanor's confession is seeping into his subconscious, altering his perception of justice and blurring the line between right and wrong. Her words from their interrogation replay in his mind. Justice isn't about the law, detective. It's about the balance. The next day, Thorne decides to confront Eleanor with everything he's learned, hoping to push her into a mistake or admission that reveals her true motivations. He mentions his vision, framing it as a question, and Eleanor's eyes light up with a strange satisfaction. "You're beginning to understand," she murmurs, her voice almost reverent. "It's not a choice, detective. It's a calling. Those of us who see the truth must bear the weight of it. We're different, chosen." Thorne feels a chill as Eleanor's words hit too close to home. She seems to be suggesting that he, too, has been chosen to carry on her legacy, to continue her work as an arbiter of justice outside the law. Thorne realizes, with growing horror, that Eleanor's confession was never just an admission of guilt. It was a recruitment, a way to pass on her beliefs and manipulate him to her twisted worldview. She sees him as a successor, someone who can continue her mission under the guise of law and order. Detective Blackwood observes Thorne's reaction, sensing his inner turmoil. "Don't let her get to you, Alaric," he warns. "She's trying to pull you into her darkness. Remember who you are." Thorne nods, though Eleanor's influence lingers. He wonders if there's a part of himself that is indeed susceptible to her philosophy, a part he'd never confronted until now. Back at the station, Blackwood comes across a new lead, a property once owned by Cassian Hawthorne's family, an old cabin in the mountains outside of Willowmere. They decide to visit the site, hoping it holds answers to Eleanor's connection to Cassian and the origins of her beliefs. As Thorne and Blackwood prepare to leave for the cabin, Thorne can't shake the feeling that he's stepping into Eleanor's world, a world governed by its own twisted version of justice. He realizes he's been drawn into a psychological game, one where Eleanor's motives and her connection to Cassian blur the boundaries of right and wrong. The cabin promises answers, but Thorne wonders if he's ready to face them. Or if, by doing so, he'll risk losing himself in Eleanor's shadow. Detectives Thorne and Blackwood drive up the winding mountain road toward Cassian Hawthorne's old cabin, a place barely marked on any map. They brought only basic supplies and a flashlight, unsure what they'll find but feeling a mounting sense of dread. The location, hidden away in the dense forest, feels disconnected from reality, like entering another world. The two detectives arrive at the abandoned cabin, a small, decaying structure shrouded in shadows. The cabin looks untouched, with ivy crawling up the walls and moss covering the stone path leading up to it. Thorne feels a pang of anticipation as they approach, sensing that the secrets hidden here might finally unravel Eleanor's twisted motivations and expose Cassian's true influence over her life. They break open the door, stepping into a dark, musty room filled with dust-covered furniture and remnants of the past. The cabin's main room is sparse, containing little more than a fireplace, a broken chair, and a small desk. But Thorne's attention is drawn to the desk, where a leather-bound journal rests alongside a handful of worn documents. As they flip through the journal, they find it's written in Cassian Hawthorne's handwriting, filled with disturbing thoughts on justice, morality, and power. His words reveal an obsession with purging society of corruption, taking justice into his own hands when the system failed. The more they read, the more Thorne sees Cassian as a fanatic, someone who saw himself as a judge and executioner, unbound by the limitations of law. Cassian's writings describe a belief in the balance of justice, where certain individuals marked by corruption or crime must be removed to restore harmony. His tone is chillingly detached, clinical, as though he were describing a mathematical equation rather than human lives. Thorne realizes this belief system is the foundation of Eleanor's actions, passed down from Cassian like an infectious ideology. Among the journal entries, they find references to people Cassian had purged, including details similar to those in Eleanor's records. Some of these names overlap with Eleanor's supposed victims, hinting that her work may have been a continuation of Cassian's, a legacy she took up after his death. Thorne and Blackwood also uncover letters addressed to Cassian from various individuals, many signed only with initials. The letters express admiration for Cassian's purges and detail morally dubious people they believe deserve to be judged. The language is reverent, as though Cassian had followers who shared his views and regarded him as a prophet of justice. Thorne realizes that the Darklight Circle wasn't merely a secret society, it was a cult of vigilantes, driven by a fanatical belief in justice outside the law. One letter in particular stands out, dated shortly before Cassian's death, from a woman with the initials EW. Thorne's stomach tightens, realizing this must be Eleanor. In the letter, she expresses gratitude to Cassian for awakening her, writing, "Your guidance showed me the truth about justice. I now understand the sacrifices we must make." The letter is chilling, a written testament to the ideological hold Cassian had over her, even from beyond the grave. Thorne's mind races as he pieces together the timeline. Eleanor didn't start as a killer, she was drawn into Cassian's belief system, indoctrinated into seeing justice as a calling. Somewhere along the way, she transformed, becoming a willing executor of Cassian's ideals. But the letters suggest there may be more followers, individuals who still believe in Cassian's message and might be carrying on Eleanor's work. Detective Blackwood looks up, visibly disturbed. "This isn't just about her, Alaric. If there are others out there, she might have started something we can't stop." Thorne's grip on the journal tightens, a chill running down his spine. Eleanor's confession wasn't just an ending, it was a handover, a way of passing Cassian's twisted legacy to others, possibly even to him. In the corner of the cabin, Blackwood notices a tapestry bearing the spiral symbol they saw in Eleanor's basement. Beneath it, they find a locked wooden box containing small, ritualistic items, a dagger, candles, and a vial of an unknown dark substance. The spiral, they now realize, was Cassian's chosen symbol, representing what he saw as the never-ending cycle of justice and retribution. Thorne can't shake the feeling that Eleanor wanted him to see this, to understand Cassian's vision fully. The thought fills him with dread. Her words echo in his mind. Justice isn't about law, it's about balance. The spiral, a cycle without end, is a haunting reminder that Cassian's philosophy was meant to continue indefinitely, with new judges taking up the mantle. As Thorne and Blackwood leave the cabin, they hear the snap of a branch nearby. Startled, they turn to find a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It's an older man, gaunt and pale, watching them with an unsettling gaze. Thorne's hand moves instinctively to his holster. The man raises his hands, signaling he means no harm, and steps forward. He introduces himself as Oswin Armitage, one of Cassian's associates and a former member of the Darklight Circle. His voice is calm, eerily composed. "I expected you might come here eventually," he says. "Cassian would have wanted it." Thorne's mind races, and he demands answers, asking why Oswin and others are still keeping Cassian's legacy alive. Oswin's expression is blank, as though he's answering an obvious question. Justice isn't an act, it's a cycle. Cassian knew this. He believed there would always be those willing to see the world as it truly is. Oswin admits that he knew Eleanor, and that her confession was part of a larger plan. "She knew her time was ending," Oswin says, his gaze piercing. "She wanted the torch to be passed. Not everyone can bear the weight of justice, but you're closer than you think." Thorne feels a wave of revulsion, but also a strange sense of inevitability. Eleanor's confession was carefully calculated, not just as an admission of guilt, but as a recruitment, an invitation to join a vision he had no desire to be part of. Back at the station, Thorne reflects on Oswin's words. He feels trapped in a psychological web. Eleanor spun with meticulous precision, as though she'd known all along that he would question his own beliefs. Her intent wasn't just to confess. It was to make him question the nature of justice, to pull him into a mindset he'd sworn to resist. Thorne realizes with growing horror that Eleanor's legacy doesn't need him to act on it directly. It only needs him to doubt, to wonder, to let her twisted philosophy take root in his mind. It's a legacy that sustains itself through doubt, through the idea that sometimes justice may require actions outside the bounds of law. Back at the station, Detective Thorne sits in his dimly lit office, the spiral symbol from Cassian's journals looming large in his mind. He can't shake the feeling that Eleanor's confession was a trap, designed to plant doubts, unravel his convictions, and ensnare him in her twisted sense of justice. As he stares at the mountain of evidence he and Blackwood have gathered, Thorne's realization hits hard. The Darklight Circle isn't a relic of the past, it's still active. Determined to find out who else may be carrying on Cassian's and Eleanor's beliefs, he instructs Blackwood to dig into every record connected to Eleanor's travels, searching for gaps or unexplained absences in her life. They're looking for a pattern, something that might reveal others she may have mentored or influenced over the years. As they dig through Eleanor's records, they find several unexplained gaps in her life. Periods where she seemed to disappear for months or even years at a time, often resurfacing in a new town with a new identity. During each of these periods, the detectives find a cluster of unsolved deaths or disappearances, all of which fit the profile of Cassian's and Eleanor's so-called justice. One gap stands out, a period in the 1980s when Eleanor lived under an alias, close to another known associate of the Darklight Circle. The deaths surrounding this associate, someone named Sylvan Tyndall, match Eleanor's methodology and her pattern of targeting morally dubious individuals. Thorne and Blackwood realize that Eleanor may have operated with different partners over the years, spreading her influence far and wide. Thorne's investigation reveals that, while some of Eleanor's activities went unnoticed, others were carefully orchestrated to avoid suspicion. She and her associates appear to have operated like a decentralized cult, with each member carrying out acts of justice independently, yet connected by Cassian's core principles. Blackwood's face grows pale as he examines a map marked with locations of the murders and disappearances linked to Eleanor and her associates. This isn't just random, Alaric. It's like they were targeting specific people, like a network, he says, shaken. Thorne nods grimly, realizing that the influence of the Darklight Circle extends further than they imagined. Each associate seems to have taken up Cassian's philosophy, fulfilling a mission of justice that goes beyond legal boundaries, a network woven into the fabric of each town they touched. As the detectives dig deeper, they uncover recent police reports that raise alarms. A series of recent unsolved crimes bear disturbing similarities to Eleanor's methods, targeting individuals with a history of corruption or violence who evaded the justice system. Thorne and Blackwood realize that they're not just dealing with Eleanor's past crimes, they're witnessing her legacy unfold in real time. The two detectives realize there could be active members of the Darklight Circle who are continuing Eleanor's work. Thorne feels a sense of urgency, knowing they may be racing against time to prevent further deaths. He instructs Blackwood to start cross-referencing these recent incidents with known associates of Eleanor, focusing on towns she'd visited in her missing years. That night, Thorne is startled by a call from Oswin Armitage, the former associate of Cassian they encountered near the cabin. Oswin claims he has information that can help, but insists on meeting in person. Thorne reluctantly agrees, feeling both wary and intrigued, aware that Oswin may still be loyal to Cassian's twisted philosophy. Thorne meets Oswin in a secluded spot, a narrow alley behind an abandoned warehouse. Oswin's demeanor is calm, almost smug, as though he holds the upper hand. "Eleanor wanted you to see the truth, detective," he begins. "She believed you could understand the work we've done, that you might even see it as necessary." Thorne's jaw clenches as he restrains his anger. "Necessary?" he snaps. "You've murdered people, manipulated justice, all while pretending it's some higher calling." Oswin smirks. "Pretend? Detective, we've done what you and your system couldn't. People who would have destroyed lives, we ended them before they could do more harm. Eleanor wanted you to know this wasn't just her work. It's a movement, one that's been happening right under your nose. Oswin reveals that Eleanor's confession was part of a calculated plan. She knew her time was limited and wanted to pass on her legacy before she could no longer act. There are others, Detective. Others who are willing to take up her work. You can try to stop us, but you'll only find shadows. We don't hide in plain sight. We're everywhere. Thorne realizes the grim truth. Eleanor's confession wasn't an end, but a recruitment. She wanted him to see the darkness she and Cassian lived by, to leave a seed of doubt in his mind that might someday sprout into a willingness to cross moral boundaries. Oswin's words solidify what Thorne feared all along, that Eleanor wanted him to continue her work, not out of compulsion, but as a choice. Thorne and Blackwood returned to the station, determined to dismantle the network of vigilantes carrying on Cassian's legacy. They dig through files, tracking down the names of individuals who may have interacted with Eleanor or Oswin over the years. Each name leads them closer to understanding how the Darklight Circle functions, a web of people united by a twisted belief in their right to judge others. As they examine case after case, the detectives grow increasingly alarmed. They're not just dealing with a few scattered followers, but a well-organized, far-reaching network that spans multiple towns, possibly even cities. Thorne realizes that Eleanor's confession was just one thread in a web that's been expanding for decades. In a final interrogation, Thorne confronts Eleanor with everything he's learned. He lays out the connections, the murders, and the resurgence of the Darklight Circle's activities. This isn't about justice, he tells her, his voice thick with anger. It's about control. You think you're above the law, above humanity itself. Eleanor's eyes flicker with a faint glint of triumph. You're so close, Detective, but you still don't understand. She leans forward, her gaze unwavering. Justice doesn't end. It evolves. Even when I'm gone, it will continue, as long as people like you exist to question it. Her words strike a nerve, and Thorne realizes the depth of her manipulation. She has not only confessed to manipulate him, but has instilled a legacy that challenges his very beliefs about justice. In the quiet of his office, Thorne wrestles with Eleanor's parting words. She has left him with a profound question, a moral battle that threatens to consume him. He understands that her twisted vision of justice is seductive, an ideology that tempts him to take the law into his own hands when the system fails. Yet, he knows the danger of crossing that line. He realizes that his battle isn't just with Eleanor or the Darklight Circle, but within himself. Her confession was more than just a story. It was a challenge, a psychological game that threatens to tear down the very fabric of his principles. Thorne knows he must act quickly. If he doesn't dismantle this network, Eleanor's legacy will only grow stronger, fueled by the influence she's cultivated and the loyal followers she's inspired. Thorne and Blackwood begin reaching out to law enforcement contacts in neighboring towns, hoping to build a coalition to identify and stop every remaining member of the Darklight Circle. A week later, Detective Thorne stands at the center of the Willowmere police station, surrounded by colleagues from neighboring towns. His investigation has unearthed a chilling reality. The Darklight Circle has expanded over the years, embedding itself in multiple communities. Thorne knows that bringing down this network will require coordination across jurisdictions, a fight that could take years. But his mission tonight is clear. He must confront Eleanor one final time. As he approaches the interrogation room, Thorne braces himself, knowing this encounter will likely be his last with her. Eleanor has manipulated him from the beginning, using her confession to challenge his beliefs and sow seeds of doubt. But Thorne is resolute. He will not allow her twisted vision of justice to consume him. Thorne steps into the room where Eleanor sits, her frail figure as composed as ever. Her face lights up with a faint, almost triumphant smile. She knows he's come for answers, but she also senses his resolve. For the first time, Eleanor appears wary, as though realizing she may have misjudged him. "You've gone to great lengths, Eleanor," Thorne begins, his voice cold and unwavering. "Your confession, your network, this so-called legacy of justice. But it all ends here. I won't let you poison anyone else with your twisted beliefs." Eleanor's expression remains neutral, though a flicker of something, perhaps disappointment, crosses her face. "You think you can end what we've built? Justice doesn't die, Detective. It adapts. It finds those who are willing to see it through." Thorne counters, This isn't justice, Eleanor. It's vengeance, cloaked in self-righteousness. You and Cassian corrupted people with your beliefs, creating a cycle of violence. Eleanor takes a slow breath, gathering her thoughts. She begins to explain her philosophy in a chillingly calm tone, detailing how she and Cassian believed that the world needed individuals who could go beyond law, people who could do what others were too afraid to do. She describes justice as something unattainable through systems, something that requires a personal, often violent touch. What you call vengeance, detective, I call necessary, she says. The system fails time and again. We've seen it, you've seen it, and so we step in to correct what's broken. Thorne's jaw tightens. Her words echo the doubts that have plagued him throughout the investigation, but he resists, knowing that to accept her viewpoint is to give in to the darkness she represents. Eleanor leans forward, her gaze penetrating. Think of the lives that could be saved, detective. The families that wouldn't suffer. We take one life to protect many. You of all people understand this. Thorne feels a surge of anger, but he pushes it down, determined to confront her manipulation head-on. You're wrong. This ends with you. There are ways to achieve justice without destroying everything it stands for. Eleanor's eyes narrow, realizing her influence over him has weakened. In a last attempt, she tries to plant one final seed of doubt. Even if I'm gone, the cycle will continue, Alaric. There will always be those willing to do what's necessary, people who aren't blinded by laws and rules. You can't stop the inevitable. Thorne stands, looking down at Eleanor with a newfound clarity. No, Eleanor, I won't be part of this cycle. You wanted me to question myself, to doubt the system. But all you've shown me is the damage people like you cause, the chaos, the suffering. Justice isn't yours to control. It's meant to protect, not destroy. Eleanor's face hardens, her expression shifting from calm to something more desperate. For the first time, her confidence wavers. She realizes she has failed to sway him, and a shadow of defeat flickers in her eyes. As Thorne turns to leave, Eleanor speaks one last time, her voice soft and almost pleading. You can deny it all you want, detective, but remember, justice is a burden. And one day, you'll see that burden for what it is, a call to act, to decide who deserves to walk free. Without responding, Thorne exits the room, leaving Eleanor alone. He knows her words will linger, but he also knows he's chosen his path. She has lost the power to manipulate him, and her legacy ends here, in this room, with this confession. Back in his office, Thorne and Blackwood launch a coordinated effort to track down every member of the Darklight Circle, identifying people who may still carry on Eleanor and Cassian's twisted beliefs. Over the next few months, they work with law enforcement across regions to dismantle the network, gradually cutting off each branch until the organization is weakened beyond recovery. Months later, Thorne visits the now abandoned cabin of Cassian Hawthorne, the place where Eleanor's dark journey truly began. Standing in the silence, he reflects on everything he has learned, the seductive nature of power, the pull of vigilante justice, and the danger of believing oneself to be above the law. He feels a sense of closure, knowing that he's rejected Eleanor's philosophy, choosing instead to uphold the integrity of the system he serves. In the stillness, he feels the weight of the journey lift, replaced by a resolve to guard his own beliefs more fiercely, aware now of how fragile they can be. He turns his back on the cabin and walks away, leaving Cassian, Eleanor, and their twisted legacy behind him.